black doctor was humiliated and forced out of her first-class seat mid-flight. Minutes later, the flight attendant who made the decision faced consequences no one saw coming. What happened next left the entire airline stunned. Before we start the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped into the aircraft with an air of quiet authority. Her presence was unmistakable. Sharp eyes, a graceful posture, and a tailored navy suit that spoke of both precision and elegance. Her matching carry-on, impeccably organized, trailed behind her like a silent testament to her attention to detail. Although Dr. Carter was accustomed to operating in environments where her achievements went largely unacknowledged until she chose to speak, today she yearned for a tranquil, uneventful flight. With a prestigious medical conference awaiting her keynote address the following morning, she was deeply absorbed in reviewing her meticulously prepared notes. As she strolled down the corridor of the first-class cabin, Dr. Carter exchanged a polite nod with a flight attendant at the entrance, before settling into her designated seat by the window. She carefully stowed her bag in the overhead compartment and arranged her space with practiced ease. Drawing out her tablet and a sleek leather notebook, the essential tools of her trade, she immersed herself in her work, her pen dancing fluidly across the page. Meanwhile, the other first-class travelers busied themselves with familiar routines. Some tapped away on their smartphones, while others savored their complimentary beverages. Not long after, Vivian Blackwell, a flight attendant known for her rigid adherence to protocol and an air of authority, made her entrance into the first-class cabin. Her crisp uniform and steely demeanor commanded respect. Yet as her eyes fell upon Dr. Carter, something in her expression subtly shifted. Although Vivian did not speak immediately, her lingering gaze hinted at an internal calculation, as if assessing every detail of Dr. Carter's presence. Oblivious to this silent scrutiny, Dr. Carter continued to focus on her preparations. Minutes later, as the cabin resonated with the soft hum of boarding announcements, Vivian reappeared beside Dr. Carter's row. "Excuse me," she said in a tone that was polite but carried an edge. "May I see your boarding pass?" Dr. Carter looked up, a slight surprise flickering across her features, but she remained unruffled. "Of course," she replied calmly, handing over her neatly folded ticket. Vivian scanned it with a discerning eye, her expression hardening. "This is for first class," she remarked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, that's correct," Dr. Carter answered with a small, steady smile. There was a brief pause before Vivian, clearly not satisfied with the exchange, handed back the ticket. "All right," she said curtly as she turned away, her tone leaving no room for further debate. Dr. Carter simply shook her head and resumed her work, assuming the incident was merely a routine check. Yet the undercurrent of tension was far from over. From the periphery of her vision, Dr. Carter noticed Vivian engaging in a hushed conversation with another flight attendant near the galley. Their glances, heavy with concern, briefly met hers before darting away. Although Dr. Carter maintained her composure, a flicker of unease stirred within her. This was not the first time she had felt scrutinized in spaces where she belonged, and over the years she had mastered the art of navigating such moments with quiet dignity. A few moments later, Vivian returned, this time exuding a sterner, more commanding presence. Addressing Dr. Carter directly, she began, "Dr. Grant," the words hanging in the air as she glanced pointedly at the tablet and notebook on the lap of Dr. Carter, as if to verify her identity. "I need to speak with you privately." Puzzled by the abrupt formality, Dr. Carter set her belongings aside. Rising gracefully, she followed Vivian toward the galley. As they moved, the ambient chatter in the first-class cabin gave way to curious, muted glances from fellow passengers. Dr. Carter could almost feel the weight of their stares, yet she held her head high, her resolve unbroken. Upon reaching the galley, Vivian folded her arms and fixed her gaze directly on Dr. Carter. "It seems there's been an error with your booking," she said. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move to the main cabin for a moment." Dr. Evelyn Carter didn't respond. The words hung in the air, and she studied Vivian Blackwell's face, searching for any sign that this was a misunderstanding. Dr. Evelyn Carter felt a sudden, inexplicable weight settle over her as she listened to the conversation unfolding. "I don't believe there's been an error," she said evenly. "My ticket was purchased weeks ago and confirmed. Could you check again?" "I've already checked," Vivian Blackwell replied, her voice growing colder. "This seat doesn't seem appropriate for you." The subtle implication in Vivian's words was unmistakable, and Dr. Evelyn Carter felt a surge of frustration rising within her. Instead of reacting impulsively, she allowed the silence to speak for her. "I'm not sure what you mean by appropriate," Dr. Evelyn Carter said carefully, "but I assure you, my ticket is valid." Vivian stiffened, glancing toward the cockpit door as if seeking silent validation. "I don't have time to argue about this either. You move or I'll have to involve security." The conversation had shifted from confusing to outright hostile. Though Dr. Evelyn Carter's patience was wearing thin, she maintained her composure. "If that's your decision," she said quietly, "then I'll comply." With that, she turned and walked back to her seat to retrieve her belongings, aware of the growing murmurs around her. Escorted by Vivian Blackwell into the cramped seat of the economy cabin, Dr. Evelyn Carter found herself wedged between two strangers. The stark contrast between the refined atmosphere of first class and the claustrophobic reality of economy only deepened the sting of injustice she had just endured. She carefully stowed her bag beneath the seat and adjusted her posture, noticing how some passengers whispered quietly or cast sympathetic glances in her direction while others avoided her gaze altogether. Determined not to let this indignity pass without action, she retrieved her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a familiar name. Without hesitation, she tapped the number and brought the phone to her ear. "Hi, it's Dr. Evelyn Carter," she said softly, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention. "I need a favor. Something happened on this flight, and I'd like it addressed immediately." "Yes, I'll send the details shortly. No need to escalate yet. Just stay on standby," came the calm reply. She ended the call as swiftly as it had begun, her expression calm yet purposeful. Back in first class, Vivian Blackwell moved through the cabin with an air of satisfaction as she handed out drinks and checked on passengers. Although she smiled warmly at some, her mind was preoccupied with the removal of Dr. Evelyn Carter, a measure she had deemed necessary to maintain the integrity of the first-class experience, even if she couldn't quite articulate why. Yet, as the flight continued, Vivian's confidence began to waver. Subtle glances from other crew members spoke volume. Drew, the senior flight attendant with years of experience, observed the unfolding scene with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Approaching Vivian in the galley before she could return to her tasks, he asked in a direct but calm tone, "What's going on with the woman you moved?" Vivian shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "There was a mix-up with her ticket. I handled it." Drew raised an eyebrow. "Handled it? Are you sure about that? First-class passengers don't usually take kindly to being moved, and neither does the airline." Vivian bristled at his remark, replying quickly, "It's fine. I followed protocol." Drew didn't press further, but his expression made it clear he wasn't convinced. Though Vivian dismissed the flicker of doubt that crept in, an uneasy tension lingered in the air. Meanwhile, Dr. Evelyn Carter quickly typed a concise message on her phone. "Monitor for now. I'll signal when needed." After sending it, she slipped the device back into her bag and leaned back in her seat, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest. Not out of anger, but as she methodically calculated her next move. In the economy cabin, Ava Mitchell, one of the newer attendants with a gentle demeanor, approached Dr. Evelyn Carter cautiously, holding a small bottle of water. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" she asked in a kind, genuine tone. Dr. Evelyn Carter looked up and returned a calm smile. "Thank you, I'm fine," she said, accepting the water. "Just a little mix-up, I suppose." Ava hesitated, sensing there might be more to the story, but Dr. Evelyn Carter's composed demeanor gently discouraged further questioning. "Well, if you need anything, please let me know," Ava offered before moving on. She wasn't one to act impulsively, and she knew that timing was everything. For now, she would wait. The pieces were already in motion, and soon, the ripple effects of Sophia's actions would begin to unfold as the plane cruised at 300 FT. The hum of the engines filled the cabin. Dr. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in her cramped seat, her posture unruffled even as her mind worked with methodical precision. Every so often she stole a glance at the window, where her reflection in the glass served as a constant reminder of the dignity she refused to relinquish. Suddenly her phone buzzed discreetly in her lap. She glanced at the message, acknowledged, standing by for further instructions, and allowed a small, knowing smile to play on her lips. Dr. Carter was not one to seek out confrontation, but when faced with blatant disrespect, she knew exactly how to respond with precision. Every action she now took was deliberate, designed not to escalate the situation, but to ensure accountability. Back in first class, Vivian Blackwell was beginning to feel the first cracks in her confidence. The normally absorbed passengers now appeared unusually alert, their whispers and sidelong glances adding weight to the unspoken judgment that pressed down on her. Even Drew, the senior attendant, cast occasional disapproving looks in her direction. Finally, he approached her near the galley, his tone sharper than before. "Are you absolutely sure there wasn't a mistake with that passenger?" he asked, gesturing subtly toward the economy cabin. Vivian stiffened, her jaw tightening. "I've already checked everything," she replied defensively. She didn't belong in first class. Drew frowned and leaned closer so that their conversation wouldn't carry. "So what exactly made you think that? Was it her ticket, her behavior, or something else?" Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but the words faltered. For the first time, she realized she could not pinpoint a legitimate reason. The naturalness of her assumption now unraveled under Drew's scrutiny. "I had a feeling," she said weakly, avoiding his gaze. Drew sighed, his expression darkening. "You'd better hope your feeling doesn't blow back on you. First-class passengers aren't just customers, they're connections. You mess with the wrong person, and it's your career on the line." Though Vivian's stomach twisted at his words, she quickly brushed them aside, clinging to the belief that she had handled the situation correctly. Still, an unshakable unease lingered. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Dr. Evelyn Carter remained composed despite the chaos around her. Surrounded by a cramped space and the murmurs of fellow passengers, she opened her meticulous notebook and began jotting down notes. To an observer, it might have seemed she was simply brainstorming for her upcoming conference, but every careful stroke was a plan for her next move. Ava Mitchell, one of the newer attendants known for her gentle kindness, approached cautiously with a small bottle of water in hand. "Ma'am, would you like another drink or perhaps a snack?" she asked in a kind, genuine tone. Dr. Evelyn Carter looked up, her calm smile returning as she accepted the water. "Thank you, I'm fine," she replied, adding quietly, "Just a little mix-up, I suppose." Ava hesitated, sensing that there might be more to the story, but Dr. Carter's composed demeanor discouraged any further questioning. "Well, if you need anything, please let me know," Ava offered before moving on. She wasn't one to act impulsively, and she knew that timing was everything. For now, she would wait. The pieces were already in motion. Ella returned, her face filled with concern. "Ma'am, would you like another drink or perhaps a snack?" she asked softly, her kindness evident. Dr. Evelyn Carter smiled warmly, appreciating the effort. "Just water, please," she replied, "and thank you." Ava Mitchell nodded and left, but Dr. Evelyn Carter could see the worry lingering in her expression. It was clear that not everyone on this flight shared Vivian Blackwell's biases. And Dr. Evelyn Carter made a mental note to acknowledge Ava Mitchell's professionalism later. Small gestures of kindness like hers often went unnoticed. But Dr. Evelyn Carter believed in rewarding those who acted with integrity. The faint chime of the galley phone interrupted Vivian Blackwell's thoughts. She hesitated before answering, her heart pounding as she lifted the receiver. "This is Vivian," she said, trying to sound composed. The voice on the other end was firm but calm. "This is the captain. We've received a call from the airline's executive office. They're requesting clarification regarding a complaint from a passenger in first class." Vivian's grip on the phone tightened. "A complaint?" she repeated, her voice faltering slightly. "Yes," the captain replied. "The passenger, Dr. Evelyn Carter, has alleged she was unfairly removed from her seat. They've requested that you provide a full explanation of your actions upon landing. Until then, you're to avoid any further disruption and ensure all passengers are treated respectfully." Vivian's face went pale and her stomach churned. "Yes, Captain," she managed to say before hanging up, her hands trembling as she placed the phone back on the hook. For the first time, she realized she might have made a mistake, a costly one. Drew, standing nearby, noticed her reaction. "What's wrong?" he asked, in a neutral, probing tone. Vivian shook her head quickly. "Nothing, it's fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease as she turned away, busying herself with tasks to avoid further conversation. Meanwhile, Dr. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in her seat, her eyes focused on the notebook in her lap. She was aware of the small shifts happening around her, the glances from the crew, the occasional murmurs among the passengers. She glanced at her watch and then at the flight attendants moving through the aisle. It was almost time. She picked up her phone, typing a brief message before slipping it back into her bag. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried a sharp focus that hinted at the storm she was about to unleash. Vivian tried to maintain her usual composure, but the weight of the captain's words lingered heavily in her mind. Every action she took now felt like it was being scrutinized, not just by Drew, but by the passengers as well. The first-class cabin had grown unusually quiet, and the whispers among the travelers seemed to grow louder in her head. Drew, observant as ever, approached her again in the galley, this time his tone less questioning and more direct. "What's really going on? You've been on edge since that call. Did something happen with the passenger you moved?" Vivian clenched her jaw, trying to steady her voice. "It's under control, Drew," she said, though her words sounded less convincing than she intended. "The captain just wants me to provide a report after we land." Drew's brow furrowed. "A report? That doesn't sound like nothing. You know how seriously the airline takes these kinds of complaints, right? Especially when it comes to discrimination." Vivian's heart skipped a beat at the word discrimination. She bristled at the suggestion, but a small voice in the back of her mind forced her to confront the possibility. Had her actions been rooted in bias? She had convinced herself earlier that she was following protocol, but now, faced with Drew's pointed questions, her confidence began to crumble. In the economy cabin, Dr. Evelyn Carter sat silently, her outward calm masking the methodical thought process at play. She had learned long ago that the most effective way to handle situations like these was to act decisively but never impulsively. Her phone vibrated again, and she glanced down at the screen. This time the message was succinct. "Confirmed, full attention secured." She slid the phone back into her bag, her expression unreadable. She could feel the tension around her growing, that she didn't need to look around to know the situation was shifting. Dr. Evelyn Carter's resolve only strengthened. This wasn't just about her. It was about setting a precedent, ensuring that no one else would face the same treatment she had endured. Meanwhile, back in first class, Vivian Blackwell's nerves were unraveling. Her movements became more rigid, her smile forced and brittle, as she attended to the passengers. Her unease didn't go unnoticed. One of the passengers, a sharply dressed businessman, finally spoke up. "Excuse me, wasn't there a woman seated here earlier? I saw her being moved. What was that about?" Vivian froze, the question catching her off guard. "There was a mix-up with her ticket," she replied defensively. The businessman didn't look convinced. "A mix-up?" he repeated. "She seemed to have a valid ticket when she boarded." That didn't sound like a mix-up to him. Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, their curiosity turning to skepticism. The cabin suddenly felt suffocating, and Vivian quickly excused herself, retreating to the galley. Drew watched her retreat, shaking his head slightly. He could see the cracks forming and knew it was only a matter of time before they widened. Whatever Vivian had done, it was clear that it wasn't going to blow over quietly, and if his instincts were right, the passenger she had crossed wasn't just anyone. Back in the main cabin, Dr. Evelyn Carter reached for her notebook again. With deliberate, bold handwriting, she wrote a single line: "Define change." Then, closing the notebook, she leaned back in her seat, a faint hint of a smile tugging at her lips. The pieces were in place, and soon the ripple effects of Vivian Blackwell's actions would become impossible to ignore. Vivian paced the galley, her heart racing and her thoughts spinning out of control. The businessman's pointed question replayed in her mind, each word sharpening the realization that her actions weren't being brushed aside. The captain's call, Drew's subtle warnings, and now the unease among the passengers all converged, building up until she could ignore it no longer. For the first time, Vivian felt the fragile foundation of her authority slipping away, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of dread. Drew, standing nearby, watched her closely. He didn't say anything at first, letting her pace and fumble with trays and cups. But when she dropped a cup of water onto the galley counter, he finally broke the silence. "Vivian," he said in a calm but firm voice, "you need to tell me what's really going on. If there's a problem, you'd better face it now because it's not going to disappear on its own." She shot him a sharp glance, her defensiveness kicking in again. "I already told you, Drew. It was a ticket issue. I handled it." Drew crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "You handled it?" he repeated. "If by handled it you mean moving a paying first-class passenger to economy without a valid reason, then yeah, you handled it all right, but that's not going to fly, pun intended, with the airline. Do you even know who she is?" Vivian stiffened, her defense faltering. "She's just..." She looked out of place, she admitted reluctantly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I thought maybe she had gotten the wrong seat." Drew's expression shifted from skeptical to outright disapproving. Leaning in closer, lowering his voice but not his tone, he said, "You thought she looked out of place? That's your justification? Do you even hear yourself? This isn't a random traveler. We're talking about Dr. Grant, a high-profile passenger." He didn't need to finish his sentence. The weight of what he left unsaid was clear. Vivian's heart sank further. She wanted to argue, to defend herself. But Drew's words struck too close to the truth she had been avoiding. She had acted on instinct, a gut feeling that she now realized was nothing more than an unfair bias. And now she was standing on the brink of facing the full consequences of that decision. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Dr. Evelyn Carter sat with an air of quiet determination. Her phone vibrated again, but this time she didn't need to check the message. She already knew things were unfolding exactly as planned. She looked out the window, her reflection calm but purposeful, while her thoughts remained as steady as her outward appearance. Ava Mitchell, the empathetic flight attendant, returned to Dr. Evelyn Carter's row with a soft smile, asking, "Ma'am, can I get you anything else?" "Thank you, Ava." Dr. Evelyn Carter replied, her voice warm but measured. "You've been wonderful. There was no need to say more." The gratitude in Dr. Evelyn Carter's tone was genuine, and Ava felt it as she moved on. Dr. Evelyn Carter glanced across the aisle where a fellow passenger, a middle-aged woman with a curious expression, leaned in slightly, saying in a hushed tone, "That flight attendant, she seemed out of line. Are you all right?" Dr. Evelyn Carter offered a polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you. Sometimes people make mistakes, and it's important to address them appropriately." The woman nodded, her curiosity still evident but tempered by Dr. Evelyn Carter's composed demeanor. Around them, a few passengers exchanged quiet glances. Their whispers carried subtle traces of sympathy and intrigue. Dr. Evelyn Carter noticed, but she didn't react. She wasn't here to gather support or make a scene. Her focus remained on the larger picture. In first class, however, the tension had reached a breaking point. The murmurs among passengers had grown louder, and Drew was now the recipient of more than one concerned inquiry. "What's going on with that passenger who was moved?" asked another businessman, his tone curious but firm. Drew responded diplomatically, brushing off the questions with vague reassurances, but even he could feel the weight of the situation escalating. Then the intercom buzzed and the captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'd like to remind you that all passengers should remain seated unless necessary. Our crew is here to ensure your comfort, so please don't hesitate to ask if you need anything." The routine announcement did little to calm Vivian Blackwell's nerves. She felt as though the walls of the plane were closing in on her. Each passing moment amplified her fear. She knew she needed to prepare for whatever awaited her upon landing, but the uncertainty of it all left her paralyzed. Dr. Evelyn Carter, on the other hand, leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. She glanced briefly at her watch before closing her eyes for a moment. The quiet confidence she exuded was a stark contrast to the growing chaos behind the scenes. While Vivian Blackwell wrestled with the fallout of her actions, Dr. Evelyn Carter was already one step ahead, fully aware that the tide was turning. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the tension in the first-class section reached a near breaking point. Vivian found herself unable to focus on her tasks. Her thoughts were clouded with fear and regret. She felt the weight of every glance from Drew, from the passengers, and even her own reflection in the glossy galley cabinets. For someone who had always prided herself on maintaining control, the feeling of powerlessness was suffocating. Drew stepped closer, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation remained private. "Vivian," he said firmly, "you need to tell me what's really going on. If you don't own up to this when we land, it's only going to get worse. The airline doesn't play games with first-class complaints, especially ones that could hint at discrimination." Vivian's chest tightened at the word discrimination, the last accusation she wanted to face. Yet Drew's warning made it impossible to ignore. She turned to him, her voice shaky. "I wasn't trying to, discriminate. I just thought she didn't. Drew interrupted, his expression a mix of frustration and disappointment. "Didn't look the part. Didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger. Do you even hear how that sounds?" Vivian froze, unable to respond. Drew had put into words the exact thought she had been trying to suppress. She felt her stomach churn as the reality of her actions crashed over her like a wave. But before she could process it further, the phone in the galley buzzed again. Vivian hesitated before answering, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the receiver. "This is Vivian," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is the captain again," the voice on the other end began, calm but laced with authority. "We've received another call from the executive office. They're requesting that Dr. Evelyn Carter be given priority service for the remainder of the flight. Additionally, they've asked for a preliminary explanation of why she was removed from first class. You'll need to document everything as soon as we land." Vivian's face went pale. "Yes, Captain," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. She hung up the phone and leaned against the counter, her breath shallow. The words executive office and priority service echoed in her mind. It was becoming clear that Dr. Evelyn Carter wasn't just another passenger. She was someone with significant influence. And now, Vivian's actions were under scrutiny at the highest level. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Dr. Evelyn Carter remained composed, though she was well aware of the shift happening on the flight. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she read the message. Senior team alerted, response in progress. She slipped the phone back into her bag, her expression calm but resolute. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Dr. Evelyn Carter had spent her entire career advocating for fairness and respect, and she wasn't about to let an incident like this go unchecked. Ava Mitchell approached Dr. Evelyn Carter once more with an air of caution, asking, "Ma'am, I just wanted to check in and make sure everything is okay. If there's anything I can do to make you more comfortable, please let me know." Dr. Evelyn Carter looked up and gave Ava Mitchell a small, warm smile. "Thank you, Ava. You've been very kind. I appreciate it." Ava Mitchell hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "If I may," she said softly, "I saw what happened earlier. I just want you to know that I'm sorry if you felt disrespected. I know that's not my place." Her voice trailed off, her genuine concern evident. Dr. Evelyn Carter's smile deepened. "Thank you," she said again, her voice calm but firm. "Your professionalism speaks volumes. It's not your responsibility to fix what others have broken, but your kindness hasn't gone unnoticed." Ava Mitchell flushed slightly, clearly moved by the compliment, before nodding and stepping away. Dr. Evelyn Carter made a mental note to highlight Ava Mitchell's actions when the time came to share her account of the incident. In the first-class section, Vivian Blackwell was unraveling. She busied herself with pouring drinks and checking on passengers, but her movements were stiff and her usual composure was gone. The whispers from earlier had grown louder, and now several passengers were openly discussing what had happened. "She had a valid ticket, didn't she?" one man asked the passenger beside him, his tone incredulous. "I think so," the other replied. "I mean, she showed her boarding pass. It doesn't make sense." Vivian Blackwell tried to ignore the murmurs, but they felt deafening. She turned toward Drew, hoping for some form of reassurance, but his expression was stony. "I told you this wouldn't end well," he said quietly. "You'd better hope she's feeling forgiving, because right now, it doesn't look good." Vivian Blackwell's chest tightened further. She felt trapped, unsure of how to navigate the mess she had created. The minutes dragged on, each one amplifying her anxiety. Meanwhile, Dr. Evelyn Carter's calm demeanor remained intact as she glanced at her watch. She had been patient, but she also knew when to act. She picked up her notebook again, writing a single line before closing it. Respect is earned, not demanded. Then she slid the notebook back into her bag and adjusted her posture, preparing for the next phase of the situation. The plane continued its steady flight, but the atmosphere inside was anything but calm. The power dynamic was shifting rapidly, and Dr. Evelyn Carter knew it was only a matter of time before the consequences of Vivian Blackwell's actions became unavoidable. For now, though, she remained composed, fully aware of the storm that was about to break. The tension in the flight reached an almost unbearable level as the plane continued its journey in first class. Vivian Blackwell's nerves were visibly fraying. Each time she passed through the aisles, she felt the weight of the passengers' curious and judgmental gazes. Her usual confidence had been replaced by a rigid stiffness, and even the most mundane tasks, like pouring drinks or adjusting a passenger tray, felt like monumental efforts. Drew kept a close eye on her, his face a mask of disapproval. He knew Vivian Blackwell had made a serious misstep, and while he wanted to stay neutral, Her lack of acknowledgement or accountability made it impossible. As he prepared the next round of refreshments, he finally broke the silence between them. "Vivian," he said flatly, "you've been doing this job long enough to know better. You need to get ahead of this before it spirals even more out of control." Vivian Blackwell bristled, turning toward him with a defensive glare. "And what am I supposed to do, Drew? March back there and beg her forgiveness?" she snapped in a low, sharp voice. Drew shook his head slowly. "You can't undo what you've already done, but you can take responsibility. Sitting here pretending everything's fine isn't going to save you." Vivian Blackwell looked away, her mind racing. She wanted to believe she had done the right thing, that she had followed her instincts as a professional. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore with every glance from Drew and every whisper from the passengers. And every memory of Dr. Evelyn Carter's calm, unflinching gaze made her question her actions. Deep down, she knew she had let her biases cloud her judgment, and now the consequences were bearing down on her like a storm in the economy cabin. Dr. Evelyn Carter remained composed, but her sharp mind continued to work behind the scenes. She had already prepared a detailed account of the incident, including notes about the behavior of each crew member. The airline would have everything they needed to take action, and Dr. Evelyn Carter was determined to ensure they did. Her phone buzzed again, and she checked the screen discreetly. The message read, "Footage reviewed, all details logged, awaiting further instructions." Dr. Evelyn Carter nodded slightly to herself, a small, almost imperceptible movement that only she noticed. She wasn't one to escalate situations unnecessarily, but she had no intention of letting this one slide. The truth was already in motion, and she knew the next steps would come swiftly. Ava Mitchell, the kind and empathetic flight attendant, returned to Dr. Evelyn Carter's row, this time looking a little nervous. "Ma'am," she said softly, bending slightly so her voice wouldn't carry, "I've just been informed that the captain would like to apologize personally once we land. I hope that's acceptable." Dr. Evelyn Carter's eyes met Eva Mitchell's. Her expression was calm but pointed. "That's a good start," she replied evenly. "Thank you for letting me know." Ava Mitchell nodded and straightened, visibly relieved that Dr. Evelyn Carter didn't seem angry as she walked away. Dr. Evelyn Carter allowed herself a moment to reflect. The apology was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that no one else faced the same kind of treatment. She had worked too hard to break barriers and build her reputation, to let someone's assumptions reduce her to a stereotype. Back in the first-class cabin, Vivian Blackwell's unease had reached its peak. She was running out of tasks to keep herself busy, and the minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Just as she began refilling a passenger's drink, the intercom buzzed again. The captain's voice came through, calm, but with an undeniable undercurrent of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. As we prepare for our descent, I'd like to thank you again for flying with us. I also want to remind everyone that we're here to ensure your comfort and safety. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let the crew know." The announcement seemed innocuous, but to Vivian Blackwell it felt like a thinly veiled reminder of the mess she had created. She glanced toward the galley where Drew was watching her, his expression unreadable. She couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the judgment, the uncertainty. It was all too much. "I'm going to check on something," Vivian Blackwell muttered to Drew, avoiding his gaze as she hurried away toward the front of the plane. She needed a moment to breathe, to think, to figure out how to salvage the situation. But as she passed through the cabin, she caught sight of Dr. Evelyn Carter seated calmly in the economy section. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Vivian Blackwell felt her stomach drop. There was no anger in Dr. Evelyn Carter's gaze, no outward sign of hostility. Instead, her expression was calm, almost unnervingly so. It was the kind of calm that spoke volumes without saying a word. It told Vivian Blackwell that Dr. Evelyn Carter was in control of the situation, that every move she made had been deliberate, and that she wasn't going to back down. Vivian Blackwell quickly looked away, her heart pounding in her chest. Meanwhile, Drew sighed as he continued his work in the galley. He had seen plenty of tough situations during his years with the airline, but this one was different. The tension wasn't just about a simple passenger complaint. It was about something deeper, something more serious. And Drew knew that when the plane landed, things would come to a head. As the descent began, Dr. Evelyn Carter looked out the window, watching the cityscape come into view. She adjusted her posture, preparing for what was to come. She had done everything she could to address the situation calmly and professionally, and now it was time to let the truth unfold. She glanced at her watch, then at her bag where her phone rested silently. Everything was ready. The next move wasn't hers to make. It was the airline's. Vivian Blackwell, on the other hand, felt the walls closing in. She tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to focus on the tasks at hand. But the weight of her actions was unbearable. She knew that when the plane touched down, there would be no escape from the consequences of what she had done. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure she was ready to face them. As the plane began its descent, the air inside the cabin felt heavier than the pressurized atmosphere outside. Dr. Evelyn Carter remained composed in her economy seat, her focus sharp, while passengers began adjusting their seats and stowing away their belongings in preparation for landing. The faint hum of whispered conversations continued, with more passengers noticing the underlying tension between the crew and Dr. Evelyn Carter. A few exchanged knowing glances, their curiosity about what had unfolded earlier growing stronger with each passing moment. Vivian Blackwell, stationed near the front of the first-class cabin, was on the verge of unraveling completely. The steady descent of the plane mirrored the sinking feeling in her stomach. Every action she had taken since the start of the flight now seemed to play back in her mind with glaring clarity, each decision amplifying the realization of her mistake. She clutched the edge of the galley counter, her knuckles turning white as she tried to maintain some semblance of composure. Drew approached her again, his tone quieter this time but no less direct. "Vivian Blackwell, I don't know what you think is going to happen when we land, but this isn't going away," he said firmly. "You've got to own this. The more you try to brush it off, the worse it's going to get." Vivian Blackwell shot him a frustrated glance and hissed under her breath. "And what do you suggest I do, Drew? Admit I made a mistake and let them throw me under the bus?" Drew leaned in slightly, his expression stern. "This isn't about saving face anymore. This is about accountability. You messed up, and you know it. The airline will deal with it, but how you handle yourself right now will make all the difference." Vivian Blackwell felt the sting of his words, but said nothing. She turned away, pretending to focus on the drink cart, though her hands trembled as she poured a glass of sparkling water. Her thoughts raced as she tried to piece together a way out of the mess she had created, but deep down, she knew there was no undoing what had already been done. In the economy cabin, Dr. Evelyn Carter leaned back slightly in her seat, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest. She glanced at her watch again, noting the time. The wheels of accountability were already turning, and she had no intention of interfering with the process. Her actions during the flight had been intentional, calculated, not to seek revenge but to ensure that justice was served in a manner that was both measured and impactful. As the plane descended through the clouds, the intercom buzzed again, and the captain's voice came through, calm but authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, your tray tables are in their upright positions, and all carry-on items are stowed securely. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The announcement sent a flurry of activity through the cabin as passengers adjusted their positions and secured their belongings. Dr. Evelyn Carter took a moment to glance toward the front of the plane, her eyes briefly meeting Drew's. He gave her a subtle nod, one of acknowledgement and quiet understanding. It was clear to him now who she was. Not just a first-class passenger, but someone with significant influence. Drew wasn't sure what would happen when they landed, but he knew the fallout would be significant. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The usual rustling of seatbelts being unfastened and bags being retrieved began, but the undercurrent of tension lingered, particularly in the first-class section. Passengers exchanged glances, many of them curious about the earlier events, but hesitant to speak openly. Dr. Evelyn Carter, however, remained seated, her movements unhurried. She knew better than to rush. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and typed a brief message. Landed, proceed as discussed. After hitting send, she slipped the phone back into her bag and adjusted her blazer. There was no need to make a scene. Everything was already in motion. Vivian Blackwell, stationed near the exit door, forced a strained smile as passengers began filing out. Her usual confident demeanor was nowhere to be found. Instead, she felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly out of control. Each time a passenger passed her, she felt their judgment, even in the polite smiles and nods she received. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone on the plane was aware of what had happened. As Dr. Evelyn Carter rose from her seat and made her way toward the exit, the few remaining passengers in the cabin turned to watch her calm, composed walk, which carried an air of quiet authority, a stark contrast to the nervous energy radiating from Vivian Blackwell. When Dr. Evelyn Carter reached the exit, Vivian Blackwell forced herself to meet her gaze, her hands trembling slightly as she held a tray with a glass of sparkling water. "Thank you for flying with us, Dr. Evelyn Carter," Vivian Blackwell said, her voice faltering. Dr. Evelyn Carter paused for a moment, her sharp, unwavering eyes meeting Vivian Blackwell's. There was no malice in her expression, only a calm, measured intensity. "I'm sure this isn't the last we'll be speaking," she said smoothly, her words carrying a weight that sent a chill down Vivian Blackwell's spine. Without waiting for a reply, Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, her steps steady and purposeful. She wasn't looking back. There was no need. Behind her, the wheels of accountability were already turning, and she knew they wouldn't stop. As Vivian Blackwell stood frozen near the exit, the hum of the terminal's energy suddenly pierced through the cabin. Her heart sank as two uniformed airline security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence commanding immediate attention. They scanned the cabin before their eyes landed on her. "Are you Vivian Blackwell?" one of the officers asked. His tone was neutral, but firm. Vivian Blackwell's breath hitched. "Yes," she managed to reply, her voice barely audible. "We need you to come with us," the officer said. "There's a matter that requires your immediate attention." Vivian Blackwell's world seemed to collapse around her as the words hit her like a freight train. She glanced toward Drew, who stood silently in the galley, his expression unreadable. There was no escape now. Every action she had taken during the flight was coming back to confront her, and the reality was undeniable. The remaining crew exchanged uneasy glances as the officers escorted Vivian Blackwell off the plane. The passengers who had lingered in the terminal watched the scene unfold, their whispers growing louder. For many, it was just another curiosity in the bustling chaos of the airport. But for Vivian Blackwell, it was the moment she realized that her actions had real, lasting consequences. Consequences she wasn't prepared to face. Vivian Blackwell's hands trembled as she walked alongside the airline security officers, her every step echoing the gravity of the situation. The terminal, bustling with its usual mix of hurried travelers and chatter, felt distant, like a blur around her. She wanted to say something, to explain, but the lump in her throat made it impossible. Every instinct told her that she was about to face the consequences of the snap judgment she had made in the air, and no amount of justification would undo the damage. The officers led her to a small, windowless room in the terminal. It was plain and stark, with a simple table and 2 chairs. Vivian Blackwell took a seat hesitantly, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the officers could hear it. One of them handed her a clipboard with a standard form, the kind she had seen before but never had to fill out. It was labeled, "Incident Report. Please provide a detailed account of your actions during the flight. Vivian Blackwell, the airline's executive office, will review this along with other reports to determine the next steps," one officer said, his tone neutral but firm. Vivian Blackwell swallowed hard, gripping the pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. She stared at the blank form, her mind a chaotic swirl of emotions, fear, regret, and the sinking realization that her career was on the line. How could she explain what she had done without sounding like a villain? How could she justify acting on a gut feeling that, in hindsight, had been nothing but prejudice? Meanwhile, in the bustling terminal just beyond the security office, Dr. Evelyn Carter walked calmly toward the baggage claim. She moved with purpose, her every step deliberate. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from the airline's senior executive team. Formal investigation initiated, all necessary footage and testimony secured. She typed a brief response. Acknowledged. Ensure full accountability. Dr. Evelyn Carter reached the carousel just as the first bags began to roll out. She retrieved her sleek black suitcase with ease, her composure unshaken. A few passengers from the flight stole glances, clearly recognizing her. Some whispered quietly, their curiosity evident, but Dr. Evelyn Carter paid them no mind. Her focus was on the bigger picture. Back in the small room, Vivian Blackwell's hand hovered over the form. She had written her name, her flight number, and the date, but the section labeled Incident Description remained glaringly blank. Every word she thought to write felt hollow. How could she explain moving a paying first-class passenger to economy simply because she had decided, in a fleeting moment, that the woman didn't belong there? The door opened, and a senior airline representative stepped in, dressed in a sharp suit. He carried an air of authority that made Vivian Blackwell's stomach tighten further. He took a seat across from her, his face unreadable. "Miss Vivian Blackwell," he began, folding his hands on the table. "I'm here to ensure we have a clear understanding of what happened on this flight. This isn't just about your actions. It's about the airline's reputation and our commitment to fairness. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" Vivian Blackwell nodded weakly, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes, sir," she murmured. "Good," he continued. "Then let's start with the basics. Why did you move Dr. Evelyn Carter from her assigned first-class seat?" Vivian Blackwell hesitated, her throat dry. She could feel the weight of the representative's gaze, and the silence in the room seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought there was an error. I didn't think she belonged in first class." The representative raised an eyebrow. His tone grew sharper. "You didn't think she belonged based on what, Miss Blackwell? Her ticket was valid, her behavior was professional. What exactly led you to that conclusion?" Vivian Blackwell's face burned with humiliation. She wanted to defend herself, to claim she had been following protocol, but the truth was unavoidable. She had made an assumption, a biased, unfounded assumption that had spiraled into an incident she could no longer control. "It was a mistake," she admitted finally, her voice cracking. "I wasn't thinking clearly." The representative leaned back slightly, his expression still unreadable. "A mistake," he repeated. "Ms. Blackwell, this isn't just a minor error. Dr. Evelyn Carter is not only a respected passenger but also someone with significant connections to the airline. Her complaint has reached the highest levels of our organization. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug." Vivian Blackwell's heart sank further. The full weight of her actions and their implications pressed down on her. She knew there was no escaping this, no quick fix to undo the damage. She nodded silently, tears threatening to well in her eyes. Meanwhile, Dr. Evelyn Carter's phone buzzed again as she stepped into her waiting car outside the terminal. The message was brief but satisfying. Miss Blackwell has been removed from active duty pending a formal review, sensitivity training, and policy reforms to be announced. She set her phone down and allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. This wasn't about punishment. It never had been. It was about creating accountability and ensuring that no one else faced the same kind of treatment. Dr. Evelyn Carter's goal had always been systemic change, and now, with the wheels set in motion, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Inside the security office, Vivian Blackwell's session dragged on as the airline representative asked more probing questions. Every answer she gave felt more damning than the last, her flimsy justifications crumbling under scrutiny. By the time she finished her report, her hands were trembling and her mind was racing with the realization of what she had lost. "Thank you, Miss Blackwell," the representative said as he stood. "We will be in touch regarding the outcome of this investigation. In the meantime, you are suspended from duty." Vivian Blackwell barely managed to nod, her vision blurred with unshed tears as she was escorted out of the room. The whispers and curious glances of passing travelers in the terminal felt like a spotlight shining directly on her. Her uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a scarlet letter. She had spent years building her career, only to watch it unravel in a single day. Dr. Evelyn Carter's car pulled smoothly into the flow of traffic, leaving the chaos of the airport behind. She glanced out the window, her mind already focused on the next steps. The day's events had been draining, but they had also set the stage for something bigger than her personal experience. Accountability was only the beginning. Real change required persistence. And Dr. Evelyn Carter had no intention of stopping now. As the car moved toward the city, she felt a quiet determination settle over her. The sky stretched endlessly before her, a fitting reminder of the work that still lay ahead. Later, Vivian Blackwell sat in her car in the parking lot outside the airport, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breathing was uneven, and her thoughts were an endless loop of regret and shame. She replayed every moment of the flight, from the first glance she had given Dr. Evelyn Carter to the strained apology she had stammered at the end. For years, she had prided herself on being professional, efficient, and respected among her peers, but today, in a matter of hours, she had managed to destroy all of that. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The notification on the screen made her heart sink further. It was an email from the airline Human Resources Department. She hesitated before opening it, dreading what she knew it would contain. The message was short and formal. "You are required to attend a disciplinary hearing tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Failure to comply may result in further action. Details to follow." Vivian Blackwell felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over. She wiped them away quickly, frustration bubbling beneath her humiliation. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was the unraveling of everything she had built. Her uniform, which she had once worn with pride, now felt like a weight dragging her down. The realization that her actions had been rooted in bias she had refused to acknowledge, cut deeper than she expected. She thought about Drew's words about how she had acted on assumptions rather than facts, and the regret twisted in her chest like a knife. Meanwhile, across the city, Dr. Evelyn Carter sat in her office, reviewing the latest updates from the airline's executive team. The email outlined the initial steps being taken, Vivian Blackwell's suspension, and a formal investigation into the incident, and plans to expedite new sensitivity training for all airline staff. Attached was a draft of a public statement the airline planned to release, apologizing for the incident and committing to systemic reforms. Dr. Evelyn Carter read the draft carefully, her expression thoughtful. It was a good start, but she wasn't ready to settle for half measures. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Dr. Evelyn Carter," came the voice of Edward Hart, the airline's CEO. His tone was professional but carried a distinct note of unease. "Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I wanted to personally apologize for what you experienced on your flight. I assure you we're treating this matter with the utmost seriousness." "I appreciate that, Mr. Hart," Dr. Evelyn Carter replied evenly. "But apologies alone won't fix this. This incident isn't just about me. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. If your team is truly committed to change, then we need more than a statement." "Of course, Dr. Evelyn Carter," Mr. Hart said quickly. "We're already implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, and we'll be revising our internal protocols to ensure situations like this are addressed properly in the future." "That's a start," Dr. Evelyn Carter said, her tone measured. "But I want transparency. I expect regular updates on the progress of these initiatives, and I'd like to review the training materials before they're implemented." "This can't just be about optics, Mr. Hart. It has to be real, lasting change." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Understood," Mr. Hart finally said. "We will provide you with everything you need. Your input will be invaluable in shaping these reforms." Dr. Evelyn Carter ended the call, leaning back in her chair. She wasn't naive. She knew the airline's actions were as much about protecting their reputation as they were about addressing the root of the problem. But if her influence could push them toward genuine change, she was willing to use it. At that same moment, Vivian Blackwell was driving home, the reality of her situation pressing down on her with every mile. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. How had she let this happen? Why hadn't she thought twice before making that decision? And more importantly, what would she do now? By the time she pulled into her driveway, the weight of the day had become unbearable. She sat in her car for several minutes, staring blankly at the dashboard. She had no one to blame but herself, and that realization was harder to swallow than any disciplinary action the airline could impose. She finally stepped out of the car and walked into her small apartment. The silence inside was almost deafening. Her phone buzzed again, and she hesitated before picking it up. This time it was a message from a close friend who worked at the airline. "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. Let me know if you need anything." Vivian Blackwell stared at the message for a long moment before typing a simple reply. "Thanks. I don't know what to do." The next morning, as the city came alive with the sounds of a new day, Dr. Evelyn Carter prepared for her meeting with the airline's board. She dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, her mind focused and her notes organized. This wasn't just a meeting. It was an opportunity to push for the systemic change she had been advocating for her entire career. At the same time, Vivian Blackwell sat in a sterile conference room at the airline headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing to begin. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. When the door finally opened, 3 senior executives walked in, their expressions neutral but firm. Vivian Blackwell's heart sank as she realized this was it, the moment she would have to face the full consequences of her actions. "Vivian Blackwell," one of the executives began, her voice calm but authoritative. "Thank you for coming. We're here to discuss the incident on Flight 784 and your role in what transpired. This is a formal disciplinary hearing, and we expect full transparency in your account of the events." Vivian Blackwell nodded weakly, her throat dry. "I understand," she said, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. As the executives began questioning her, Vivian Blackwell struggled to find the right words. She knew the facts were against her, and every attempt to explain her actions only made them sound worse. By the time the hearing ended, Vivian Blackwell felt utterly defeated. The final decision would be communicated to her later, but in her heart she already knew the outcome. While Vivian Blackwell faced her reckoning, Dr. Evelyn Carter sat across from the airline's board members, outlining her expectations for the reforms. Her voice was calm but firm, her presence commanding. She wasn't just advocating for herself. She was fighting for every passenger who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or judged unfairly. The board recognized the weight of her words and listened intently. As Dr. Evelyn Carter left the meeting, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. Change wasn't guaranteed, but she had planted the seeds, and as she stepped out into the crisp morning air, she knew this was only the beginning. The day of reckoning arrived for Vivian Blackwell as the airline's disciplinary committee convened to deliver their decision. She sat in the same stark conference room where she had given her account days earlier. This time, she was alone. One by one, the panel of executives entered the room, their expressions neutral but carrying an air of finality. Each carried a folder filled with documents, testimonies, reports, and evidence from the incident. Vivian Blackwell's chest tightened as she realized that every detail of her mistake had been carefully dissected and evaluated. "Ms. Blackwell," began a senior executive, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense tone. "After reviewing the evidence, including passenger testimonies, security footage, and your own statement, we have reached a decision regarding your actions on Flight 784. Vivian Blackwell swallowed hard, her palms damp against the table. She braced herself, knowing there was no way to undo what had already been set in motion. "Your actions not only violated company policy but also jeopardized the airline's reputation," the executive continued. "While we acknowledge that mistakes can happen, your decision to act on assumptions rather than verifiable facts constitutes a serious breach of our standards for professionalism and fairness." The words felt like a hammer blow, each one driving home the reality of what Vivian Blackwell had done. She wanted to argue, to plead her case, but the logical part of her knew there was nothing left to say. She had crossed a line, and the consequences were inevitable. "Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position with the airline," the executive announced in a resolute tone. "You will receive further instructions on your severance and the handling of any remaining obligations via email. We recommend that you use this experience to reflect and, if possible, grow from the mistakes made here today." Vivian Blackwell's breath caught in her throat, and she felt the sting of tears threatening to spill. She had spent years building her career, climbing through the ranks of the airline industry, only to lose it all in a single moment of poor judgment. She nodded silently, unable to trust her voice to respond. As the executives exited the room, one of them paused briefly at the door. It was Drew, who had been invited to provide testimony during the review process. He didn't say anything at first, his expression unreadable. But then he gave her a small, somber nod, a gesture that felt more like pity than sympathy. Then he was gone, leaving Vivian Blackwell alone with the crushing weight of her actions. Meanwhile, Dr. Evelyn Carter's day unfolded in stark contrast. She sat in her office, reviewing a series of emails from the airline's executive team. Each message detailed the immediate reforms being implemented: mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, a complete overhaul of the complaint and escalation process, and the establishment of a new advisory committee to monitor fairness and accountability within the company. It was more progress than Dr. Evelyn Carter had anticipated, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. One email in particular caught her attention. It was a forwarded message from the CEO, Edward Hart, sharing the outcome of Vivian Blackwell's disciplinary hearing. Dr. Evelyn Carter read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't vindictive by nature, and while she knew Vivian Blackwell's dismissal was warranted, it didn't bring her joy. What mattered to Dr. Evelyn Carter was the larger change: the policies and practices that would prevent incidents like this from happening again. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Nia, her assistant. "The airline has issued their public statement. I thought you'd want to see it." Dr. Evelyn Carter clicked the link Nia had included, which directed her to a press release on the airline's official website. The statement began with a clear acknowledgement of the incident. "We deeply regret the events that occurred on Flight 784, in which one of our valued passengers, Dr. Evelyn Carter, experienced unacceptable treatment. This incident has highlighted areas where we must do better, and we are committed to making meaningful changes to ensure that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect." The statement went on to outline the specific reforms the airline was implementing, including the changes Dr. Evelyn Carter had pushed for during her discussions with the board. As she read, Dr. Evelyn Carter felt a sense of validation, not for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced the kind of bias she had endured. This wasn't just her victory, it was a step forward for passengers, employees, and the airline itself. Later that evening, as Dr. Evelyn Carter prepared to leave her office, her phone buzzed again. This time it was an unexpected email from Vivian Blackwell. Dr. Evelyn Carter hesitated for a moment before opening it. The message began with a simple acknowledgement of the events that had unfolded. "Dr. Carter, I owe you an apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable, and I want to take full responsibility for the way I treated you. I acted on assumptions rather than facts, and I allowed my biases to dictate my behavior. I am deeply sorry for the disrespect I showed you, and I want you to know that I am committed to learning from this experience." Vivian Blackwell's words were raw and genuine, carrying a vulnerability that Dr. Evelyn Carter hadn't expected. The email continued with Vivian Blackwell explaining how the aftermath of the incident had forced her to confront her own prejudices and shortcomings. She expressed a desire to grow from the experience and to use it as a catalyst for change in her own life. Dr. Evelyn Carter read the email carefully, noting the tone of sincerity. While she remained cautious about accepting apologies at face value, she also understood the importance of accountability and growth. After a moment of thought, she typed a brief response. "Ms. Blackwell, thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step toward growth, and I hope you continue to reflect and learn from this experience. I believe in the possibility of change, and I hope you use this opportunity to contribute positively in the future." As Dr. Evelyn Carter hit send, she leaned back in her chair, her mind calm but focused. The events of the past week had been draining, but they had also been necessary. The fight for fairness and accountability was far from over, but Dr. Evelyn Carter knew she had made an impact, and that, for now, was enough. At the same time, Vivian Blackwell sat in her apartment, staring at Dr. Evelyn Carter's response. The words weren't overly forgiving, nor were they dismissive. They were a reminder that growth was possible, but only if she took the lessons to heart. For the first time in days, Vivian Blackwell felt a faint glimmer of hope. Not for her career, but for the person she still had a chance to become. Weeks passed, and the ripple effects of the incident on Flight 784 began to take hold. The airline had rolled out its first sensitivity and bias training sessions for employees, a move that garnered both praise and scrutiny from industry professionals and the public alike. The story of Dr. Evelyn Carter and her treatment during the flight had made waves across social media and news outlets, sparking broader conversations about discrimination in professional environments. Dr. Evelyn Carter watched the developments from a distance, choosing to stay out of the public discourse. Beyond her initial role in pushing for accountability, she had always believed in leading through action, not spectacle, and the progress the airline was making spoke louder than any statement she could give. Yet her quiet influence continued to shape the reforms. She received regular updates from the advisory committee, outlining measurable improvements in employee attitudes and customer service. It was a small but significant victory, one that reminded Dr. Evelyn Carter why she had refused to let the incident slide. One day, while preparing for a meeting at her office, Dr. Evelyn Carter received a surprising email from Ava Mitchell, the empathetic flight attendant who had shown her kindness during the ordeal. Ava Mitchell wrote about how the incident had inspired her to approach her job with even more compassion and mindfulness. She shared that she had been promoted to a senior role within the airline, a recognition of her professionalism during a difficult situation. Dr. Evelyn Carter smiled as she read the email and quickly replied, congratulating Ava Mitchell and thanking her for the warmth and respect she had shown. It was a reminder that even in challenging moments, there were people who stood out for their humanity and integrity. Meanwhile, Vivian Blackwell's life had taken a vastly different turn. Her dismissal from the airline had left her reeling, but it also forced her to confront her biases and actions in a way she never had before. Determined not to let the experience define her entirely, she sought out opportunities to educate herself and rebuild. She joined a nonprofit organization focused on workplace diversity and inclusion, initially as a volunteer. Over time, her contributions grew, and she began sharing her story, not to gain sympathy, but to highlight the importance of accountability and the dangers of unchecked assumptions. Vivian Blackwell's journey wasn't easy, and it was far from over. She faced skepticism from those who doubted her sincerity, but she chose to focus on the work rather than the criticism. Each day was a step toward becoming the person she had once thought herself to be, only now with a deeper understanding of the values she wanted to uphold. One afternoon, as Dr. Evelyn Carter was heading through the airport for yet another flight, she noticed the subtle changes that had begun to take root. The staff at the check-in counters greeted passengers warmly. Flight attendants moved through the boarding lines with patience, and the overall energy felt different, more intentional. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As she approached the gate, the agent recognized her and offered an upgrade to first class. Dr. Evelyn Carter smiled and declined politely, preferring to sit where she had been assigned. She appreciated the gesture, but for her, the fight had never been about personal gain. It was about creating a space where fairness and dignity were non-negotiable. As the plane took off, Dr. Evelyn Carter leaned back in her seat, gazing out at the clouds stretching endlessly into the horizon. The events of Flight 784 had been a turning point, not just for her, but for many others. It was a reminder that change didn't happen overnight, nor did it come without resistance. But with persistence and the courage to speak up, progress was possible. Somewhere else in the city, Vivian Blackwell sat at her desk at the nonprofit drafting an outreach proposal. Her new role wasn't glamorous, and it didn't come with the prestige she had once enjoyed, but it felt meaningful. Each day was a chance to contribute to something larger than herself, to reshape the systems that had allowed her own biases to flourish. She thought often about Dr. Evelyn Carter's calm strength and the way she had handled the situation. Not with anger, but with purpose. It was a model Vivian Blackwell hoped to emulate in her own life. For both women, the journey wasn't over, but as the wheels of accountability continued to turn, their story served as a reminder of what could happen when people chose to confront injustice with determination and grace. In the end, the sky wasn't the limit. It was just the beginning. The lesson from this story is that true change and growth only happen when you're willing to admit your mistakes, take responsibility for your actions, and face the consequences, even when it hurts. The stories of Dr. Evelyn Carter and Vivian Blackwell show that acting on unchecked biases and assumptions can have far-reaching effects that damage your reputation and career. At the same time, it highlights how crucial it is to create a fair environment where everyone is treated with respect and dignity. Despite facing injustice, Dr. Carter kept her cool and took charge, turning the situation into a catalyst for systemic improvement. Meanwhile, after recognizing her error, Vivian Blackwell began a process of self-reflection and made efforts to correct her behavior, slowly rebuilding herself and striving to become a better person. Ultimately, this story teaches us that courage, persistence, and a genuine willingness to learn are the keys to sustainable growth, not just for the individual, but for the entire community. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more captivating and unforgettable stories. Stay tuned for more exciting content coming your way. See you in the next one.